A child doesn't suddenly become stubborn overnight. That word is usually something adults reach for when patience is already running thin and logic feels like it has stopped working. I remember watching this unfold countless times over the years. The same pattern, different faces, different homes, same emotional deadlock. It often starts with something small, a simple instruction: turn off the TV, do your homework, come to the table. Nothing dramatic. But the response? Silence, refusal, sometimes even a stare that feels like a challenge you didn't ask for. And that's where most adults misread the entire situation, because what looks like defiance is usually something else entirely: a developing mind trying to assert control in the only way it knows how. Children are not miniature adults with fully formed emotional brakes. Their prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control and rational decision making, is still under construction. So, when pressure rises, emotion drives the response, not logic. But here's where things get interesting. The adult brain sees refusal and interprets it as disrespect. So, the volume increases, the tone sharpens. The child, sensing loss of control, pushes back even harder. And just like that, a simple instruction becomes a full emotional standoff. I've seen this cycle repeat so many times, it almost feels scripted. What most people miss is that stubbornness is rarely about the task itself. It's about autonomy, control, a child testing, even unconsciously, do I have any say in my own world? And when that question is answered with force instead of understanding, resistance doesn't disappear, it strengthens. So, before we even get into solutions, we need to undo one major assumption. You are not dealing with a bad child. You are dealing with a developing mind in a power struggle it does not yet have the tools to articulate. Now, the real shift begins when we stop trying to win that struggle and start understanding why it exists in the first place. There's something I learned early on that most adults don't want to hear at first. The moment you turn a child's behavior into a battle of who wins, you've already lost control of the situation. Because stubbornness isn't a fixed trait, it's a reaction, a kind of emotional language. I once watched a simple morning routine turn into a full standoff, a child refusing to get dressed for school. Nothing unusual on the surface, but what followed was the familiar escalation: repeated instructions, rising tone, tighter control, and then that final point where the adult's patience snaps into authority mode. Do it now. And the child froze. Not compliant, not cooperative, just locked in resistance. That moment is what most people misinterpret as defiance. But what I've come to understand is that the child isn't responding to the task, they're responding to the feeling of being controlled. Psychologists often refer to this as psychological reactance. When a person perceives their freedom is being restricted, their instinct is to restore that freedom, even if the request itself is reasonable. Adults experience it too, but children experience it with far less emotional regulation. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens. In the adult mind, instruction equals responsibility. In the child's mind, instruction can feel like loss of control. So when pressure increases, what you get isn't cooperation. It's resistance that grows in direct proportion to how much control is being applied. There's also another layer here that's often ignored: developmental autonomy. In early childhood and adolescence, the brain is actively testing boundaries, not out of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but because identity formation requires it. A child is constantly trying to answer an internal question: am I allowed to think for myself? Now, imagine what happens when every answer to that question is no. The resistance doesn't just continue, it becomes identity based. I don't listen. I don't care. I won't do it. At that point, you're no longer dealing with a behavior issue. You're dealing with a learned pattern of opposition. And here's the uncomfortable truth: punishment alone rarely fixes this. In many cases, it strengthens it. because it confirms the child's internal belief that interaction with authority equals pressure, not understanding. So, the first real shift, the one most adults skip, is this: stop interpreting stubbornness as a refusal to obey and start recognizing it as a struggle for autonomy that has not been properly guided. Because once you see that clearly, your response stops being emotional escalation and starts becoming strategic communication. Once you stop trying to win the argument, something very interesting happens. You start noticing how often the situation was never really about the argument in the first place. I remember a moment that made this painfully clear. A child was being told again to stop delaying a task, something routine, almost trivial. The usual pattern was already forming: repetition, irritation, rising tension. Everyone in the room could feel it building toward that familiar clash. But this time, something different happened. Instead of pushing harder, the adult paused the script. No lecture, no raised voice, just a simple shift in tone: recognition. Not agreement, recognition. I can see you don't want to do this right now. And for a moment, nothing changed externally. The child still didn't move, still resisted. But internally, the temperature of the situation dropped. This is where most people underestimate what's happening psychologically. Children are not just responding to instructions, they are responding to emotional safety within the interaction. When they feel unheard, their resistance is often a form of self protection. When they feel seen, even imperfectly, the need to fight weakens. This is closely tied to co regulation, a concept in developmental psychology where a child's emotional state is influenced by the calmness or intensity of the adult. If the adult escalates, the child escalates. If the adult stabilizes, the child slowly mirrors that stability. But here's the key mistake most adults make: they think validation means surrender. It doesn't. Validation is not approval, it is acknowledgement. There is a difference between "you're right, don't do it" and "I understand you don't feel like doing it, but it still needs to be done." That second version does something powerful. It removes the emotional friction without removing the boundary. And boundaries are where structured choices come in. Instead of issuing a single command that triggers resistance, you introduce controlled autonomy. Do you want to do it now or in 5 minutes? Do you want to start with this part or that part? To an adult, this may feel insignificant. To a child's developing brain, it feels like ownership. And ownership reduces resistance because the nervous system no longer interprets the situation as imposed control. There's also a quieter psychological shift happening here: cognitive load reduction. Too many instructions, too much emotional pressure, and the child's brain flips into shutdown or opposition mode. But when choices are simplified and emotional tone is steady, cooperation becomes more accessible. What changes over time is not just behavior, it's the entire relational pattern. The child stops expecting conflict as the default interaction. And once that expectation changes, stubbornness loses its fuel. But this still isn't the final stage. Because even reduced conflict isn't the same as lasting behavioral transformation. That only happens when autonomy is not just offered in moments, but built into structure itself. This is where most parenting approaches either level up or fall apart completely. Because even when the arguments reduce, many adults still stay stuck in one hidden mindset: I must stay in control at all times or everything will collapse. And ironically, that mindset is exactly what keeps stubborn behavior alive in a quieter form. What actually creates lasting change is something far less dramatic, but far more powerful: structured autonomy. I've seen this shift happen in small, almost invisible ways. A child who once resisted every instruction begins to function differently when responsibility is no longer delivered as a command, but as a defined role. Let me explain what that looks like in real life terms. Instead of repeated instructions like "do your homework now," the structure changes to something like This is your responsibility for the evening. It needs to be completed before dinner. Nothing about the expectation changes, but the psychological experience does. Now the task is not something being imposed moment to moment. It becomes an owned responsibility inside a predictable boundary. And children respond very differently to ownership than they do to pressure. This connects directly to identity formation, one of the most important developmental processes in childhood and adolescence. When a child repeatedly experiences themselves as someone who is forced, they resist. But when they begin to experience themselves as someone who is responsible, behavior starts to reorganize around that identity. I've watched this transition happen slowly. At first, there is still resistance because identity doesn't shift overnight, but something subtle changes. The arguments reduce in intensity, then frequency, then necessity. And here's the part most adults don't anticipate: structure actually creates safety. Not rigid control, but predictable structure with room for autonomy inside it. For example, clear expectations, consistent timing, defined consequences that are calm, not emotional, freedom in how the task is completed, not whether it is completed. This balance is what reduces rebellion, because the child's brain no longer feels trapped in unpredictability or emotional negotiation every single time. There's also a deeper neurological layer here. Repetition within stable structure helps form behavioral habits through basal ganglia pathways, meaning the behavior starts to run on auto mode instead of emotional resistance loops. And once that happens, something remarkable emerges: cooperation without conflict. But I want to be very clear about something I learned the hard way through observation over time. Stubborn children are not broken, and they are not inherently difficult. Many of them are highly independent thinkers with strong internal drives. When mishandled, that strength turns into opposition. When guided properly, it becomes leadership, discipline, and resilience. So the real goal was never obedience through pressure. It was always direction through structure. And when that shift finally lands, what used to feel like daily battles quietly turns into something far more sustainable: mutual understanding built on consistency, not control. When you step back and look at the full picture, what we casually label as a stubborn child is rarely about stubbornness at all. It's usually a mismatch between how a young mind is developing and how authority is being applied to it. At the core of it, children don't reject guidance. They reject feeling erased in the process of receiving it. When every instruction feels like pressure, resistance becomes their default language. When every interaction feels like a contest, opposition becomes their identity. But when communication shifts from control to understanding, something subtle but powerful happens. The child is no longer constantly defending their sense of autonomy. And once that defensive layer drops, cooperation doesn't need to be forced. It starts to emerge naturally through structure, predictability, and calm authority. The three shifts we've walked through all point to the same truth. First, understanding that resistance is often developmental, not personal. Second, realizing that emotional validation reduces the need for power struggles. Third, building structured autonomy so responsibility becomes part of identity, not something constantly enforced. And if there's one thing experience makes very clear, it's this: you cannot punish a child into emotional intelligence, but you can guide them into it. So instead of asking, "How do I make them obey?" the better question becomes, what kind of structure helps them grow into responsibility without fear? Because in the long run, the goal was never just compliance, it was character. If this resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear your experiences in the comments, especially the moments where stubbornness surprised you or changed when you approached it differently. I do read through them, and I often reflect on real stories shared there in future discussions. And if you found this valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps build a space where we can keep breaking down parenting, behavior, and psychology in a way that actually makes sense in real life.